Mr. President, a persistent argument of my climate talks is how corrupt climate denial is. The premise of that argument is that the fossil fuel industry denial apparatus is wrong about climate change and knows it is wrong. That is my case. The fossil fuel industry denial apparatus knows it is wrong about climate change. Well, it is a beautiful world, and every once in a while, along comes something that proves my case. Last week, on the afternoon of Black Friday, the Trump administration released its national climate assessment by 13 federal agencies, describing the monumental damage the United States is facing from climate change. In more than 1,000 pages, the report contradicted nearly every fake assertion Trump and his fossil fuel flunky cabinet have made about climate change. Now, Trump's pro-polluter policies are predicated on the lies and nonsense of this fossil fuel industry denial apparatus. And this report is devastating to those policies and to those lies. So how did the fossil fuel apparatus respond? What did they do to rebut the national climate assessment? They did nothing. They did nothing. There was all that big talk from Scott Pruitt about how they were going to red team climate science. Well, here comes the climate science. Where is your red team? Nothing. Instead of engaging with this devastating report by the U.S. government's leading scientists, they tried to bury it, timing its release for a day of the year when it would be least likely to get public attention. And consider for a moment the environment in which they backed down from this challenge. No red team, no nothing. They just whimpered and ran away and tried to bury the report on Black Friday. At a time when their industry populates the Trump administration, at a time when the president is in their pocket, at a time when both houses of Congress are under fossil fuel industry control. Their phony climate denial front groups wield more influence than ever. This should have been their moment. The tell here is that even in this environment, the fossil fuel industry and its bevy of stooges in the Trump administration got this report and did nothing. Why? Why nothing? There's only one answer. Because they know they're wrong. They know the real science is right. They know their science denial campaign is phony, so they backed down. They folded like a cardboard suitcase in a rainstorm. That, my friends, is an admission. It is an admission by inaction. It is an admission that even the fossil fuel industry knows the climate science is irrefutable. Interestingly, irrefutable is just what President Trump and his family said about climate science in this full-page advertisement that they signed in the New York Times in 2009, saying that the climate science is irrefutable and that there will be catastrophic and irreversible consequences of climate change. So this new national climate assessment, plus the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report are both very clear. The irrefutable science that these two reports disclose couldn't be more clear. Damage from climate change is already occurring. There is no credible natural explanation for it. Human activity is the dominant cause. Future damage from further warming will be worse than we previously thought. Economies will suffer, and we are almost out of time to prevent the worst consequences of climate change. As the Bank of England report on this, they're the biggest financial regulator in the UK, and they said the financial risks are far-reaching in their breadth and magnitude, have uncertain and extended time horizons, are foreseeable, but these risk factors will be minimized if there is an orderly transition to a low-carbon economy, but the window for an orderly transition is finite and closing. We are almost out of time. So these two reports, they are tough stuff. As the Trump administration summary states, and I quote, "Earth's climate is now changing faster than at any point in the history of modern civilization, primarily as a result of human activities. The impacts of global climate change are already being felt in the United States and are projected to intensify," which makes sense, since in the history of human civilization, the Earth has never seen atmospheric CO2 concentrations like we have today. Many scientists have said warming of around 3 degrees centigrade is now likely. What does that mean? Heating the planet well beyond 2 degrees centigrade would create a, quote, "totally different world," says Michael Oppenheimer, a climate scientist at Princeton University. He says, "It would be indescribable. It would turn the world upside down in terms of climate. There would be nothing like it in the history of civilization," end quote. Here is what the Trump climate assessment chronicles. From our ocean state, we're concerned about sea levels, ocean acidification, and warming. We note sea levels are rising as oceans warm and upland ice melts. If fossil fuels are not constrained, the report says, and I quote, "many coastal communities will be transformed by the latter part of this century." For my coastal state, Mr. President, that's a pretty ominous warning. Along coasts, fisheries, tourism, human health, even public safety are being, and I quote the report again, "transformed, degraded, or lost," due in part to climate change impacts, particularly sea level rise and higher numbers of extreme weather events. You get the sea level coming up, that extreme weather event, which is stronger to begin with, now has a lot more ocean to throw at our shores. Out west, more frequent and larger wildfires, combined with increasing development at the wildland-urban interface, portend increasing risks to property and human life, the report says. And by the way, from 2000 to 2016, wildfires have burned at least 3.7 million acres of the United States in every single year, except for 3. From 2000 to 2016, more than 3.7 million acres burned in all years but 3. And California still smolders as I speak. More than 100 million people in the U.S. live with poor air quality, and climate change will, again quoting the report, worsen existing air pollution levels, end quote. Increased wildfire smoke threatens respiratory and cardiovascular problems. And with higher temperatures from global warming, asthma and hay fever rise. Groundwater supplies have declined over the last century, and the decrease is accelerating. Quote, significant changes in water quantity and quality are evident across the country, the report finds. Midwest farmers take a big hit. Warmer, wetter, and more humid conditions from climate change, greater incidence of crop disease and more pests, worsened conditions for stored grain. During the growing season, the Midwest will see temperatures climb more than any other region of the U.S., the report says. Crop yields will suffer, a warning that is echoed by grain giants like Cargill. Sum it all up, the report says climate change will disrupt many areas of life, hurting the U.S. economy, affecting trade, exacerbating overseas conflicts for our military. Costs will be high. I quote, with continued growth in emissions at historic rates, annual losses in some economic sectors are projected to reach hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century, more than the current gross domestic product of many U.S. states. Danger warnings already flash in some economic sectors. Freddie Mac has warned of a coastal property value crash, saying, and I quote, the economic losses and social disruption may happen gradually, but they are likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and Great Recession. Again, from a coastal state, Mr. President, that's an ominous warning. And the insurance industry agrees. Trade publication Risk and Insurance has warned, I quote, continually rising seas will damage coastal, residential, and commercial property values to the point that property owners will flee those markets in droves, thus precipitating a mortgage value collapse that could equal or exceed the mortgage crisis that rocked the global economy in 2008. End quote. And by the way, the leading edge of this may already be upon us, as coastal property values are beginning to lag inland property values, as reported by the Wall Street Journal. Separate from the coastal property values threat is another warning about a carbon bubble in fossil fuel markets. Fossil fuel reserves, now claimed as assets that are not developable in a 2-degree centigrade world, become what they call stranded assets. A recent economic publication estimated that collapse of the carbon bubble would wipe out, and I quote here, around 82% of global coal reserves, 49% of global gas reserves, and 33% of global oil reserves. A separate economic review warns that $12 trillion of fossil fuel industry financial value, and I quote here, could vanish off their balance sheets globally in the form of stranded assets. $12 trillion is over 15% of global GDP, which is why the Bank of England, who I quoted earlier, as a financial regulator, is warning of this carbon asset bubble as a systemic economic risk. Mr. President, that may be the blandest set of words in the English language that convey the worst threat. If you were to graph blandness of language and seriousness of threat, you'd probably come up with systemic economic risk. It basically means economic meltdown. Well, that's what we're looking at. This level of collapse could cascade beyond the fossil fuel companies. It's not just a question of their shareholders getting wiped out. It is such a crash that it cascades out into the global economy. A crash like that, unfortunately, hits the U.S. particularly hard because lower-cost producers can hold on and unload fossil fuel reserves into the collapsing market at fire sale prices. When they do, the economists warn, and I quote here, regions with higher marginal costs, like the United States, quote, lose almost their entire oil and gas industry, end quote. The solution is to decarbonize, to invest more in renewables, to broaden our energy portfolio away from this asset collapse risk. One paper concludes the United States is worse off if it continues to promote fossil fuel production and consumption. Another paper concludes, this is the good news, if climate policies are implemented early on and in a stable and credible framework, market participants are able to smoothly anticipate the effects. In this case, there would not be any large shock in asset prices, and there would be no systemic risk. So how do we get to eliminating this hazard of systemic risk? How do we get to no systemic risk? We do what works for us anyway, move to renewables. As this graph shows, we've got to make a big move to avoid this hazard. A carbon price, which is the remedy the fossil fuel industry pretends to support while sending its political forces out to oppose exactly the laws it pretends to support. But a carbon price would allow this big move to happen, all while generating revenue that could be cycled back to states and citizens and help the hardest hit areas of transition. The smart move that we need to make this happen does not have to be painful. We avoid a lot of pain if we make the move, but that doesn't mean the move itself has to be painful. Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz says it's a win economically. He has testified, and I quote him here, retrofitting the global economy for climate change would help to restore aggregate demand and growth. Climate policies, if well-designed and implemented, are consistent with growth, development, and poverty reduction. The transition to a low-carbon economy is potentially a powerful, attractive, and sustainable growth story, marked by higher resilience, more innovation, more livable cities, robust agriculture, and stronger ecosystems, end quote. Or we could do it the hard way, do nothing, get hit with those dire economic consequences, because the status quo is not safe. Fortune magazine summed up the Trump administration climate report quite beautifully, so I'll quote them at some length. The report catalogs the observed damage and accelerating financial losses projected from a climate now unmoored from a 12,000-year period of relative stability. What a phrase that is. The Earth's climate, which we inhabit, unmoored from a 12,000-year period of relative stability. They go on, the result is that much of what humans have built, and many of the things they are building now, are unsuited to the world as it exists. And as time goes on, the added cost of living in that world could total hundreds of billions of dollars annually, end quote. Well, which way we now go depends on the Congress of the United States, on whether Congress can put the interests of our people ahead of the interests of the fossil fuel industry. The record is not good. I will concede that. Since the Citizens United decision, the politics of climate change have turned into a tale of industry capture and control. So far, despite the fossil fuel industry's obvious conflict of interest, could there be a more obvious conflict of interest indeed? And despite their provable pattern of deception, and despite clear warnings from, well, virtually everywhere now, the Republican Party has proven itself incapable of telling the fossil fuel industry no. We tried our best for you. We held in for you as long as we could. We did everything we could think of, but we're not going to wreck our economy, our climate, our oceans, our country for you. So it doesn't look good. But the climate report does say we still have time if we act fast. Let me ask unanimous consent to add at the end of my remarks an article by Max Boot titled, "I Was Wrong on Climate Change. Why Can't Other Conservatives Admit It Too?" that concludes, why haven't other conservatives owned up to this danger? Quote, "They are captives first and foremost of the fossil fuel industry. It is a tragedy for the entire planet that the United States governing party is impervious to science and reason," end quote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll close with a reference to The Gathering Storm, Winston Churchill's legendary book about a previous failure to heed warnings. Churchill quoted a poem of a train bound for destruction rushing through the night, the engineer asleep at the controls as disaster looms. Who is in charge of the clattering train? The axles creak and the couplings strain. The pace is hot and the points are near, but sleep hath deadened the driver's ear, and signals flash through the night in vain. Death is in charge of the clattering train. I contend, Mr. President, that we are now that sleeping driver, that the signals are flashing at us so far in vain, and that it is decidedly time to wake up. I note that my distinguished colleague from Massachusetts has arrived, and we have an order in place in which the senator from Massachusetts is recognized at the conclusion of my remarks, and the distinguished senator from New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen, is recognized at the conclusion of Senator Markey's remarks. So with that, let me yield the floor to the co-author of the Waxman-Markey legislation, the person who has done most successful work to try to solve this climate problem at a time when the situation was slightly less desperate.
The senator from Massachusetts.
The Senator, I thank you, I thank you, Mr. President. I thank Senator Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse has been out here on the floor week after week after week, sounding the warning, like Churchill, that there is danger ahead, that there is a gathering storm. But it's not metaphorical, as it was for Churchill. It's real. There's a gathering storm. And what Senator Whitehouse has been doing year after year after year is coming out here on the floor to document this gathering storm and to warn that we have to take action. And I want to thank Senator Whitehouse for his incredible historic leadership because now, between the United Nations and United States scientists, all the evidence is now there. And my belief is the failure that you talked about to heed the dire warnings on climate change is much more now than that figurative gathering storm. It is literally gathering much fiercer energy, supercharged storms that will bear down on our shores as a result of our warming crisis. Scientists have shot off the warning flare. In the last 2 months, we have received 2 of the most alarming reports to date on the threat that climate change poses to our country, our economy, our security, to our planet, and questions the morality of our country. Because ultimately, that's what it is. It is a moral issue of whether or not we are going to leave this planet better than we found it. Are we going to be the stewards of this planet to pass it on to future generations better than we found it? Well, right now, the gathering evidence from the United Nations, from our own U.S. government scientists, is that we are not. The federal government's National Climate Assessment released last week, as well as the recent United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, are clarion calls. The science in these reports is clear. If we fail to act now, storms will grow more frequent, more powerful. Extreme weather events like Hurricane Michael, which grew more quickly this October than any storm we have seen, will continue to cost the United States hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. The National Climate Assessment, the congressionally mandated report issued by 13 federal agencies, underscores the specific impacts that we are facing now and will continue to face in the future. In our home region of the Northeast, where Senator Shaheen and Senator Whitehouse and I have the privilege to represent, the impacts are going to be truly devastating. The Northeast region will surpass 2 degrees centigrade of warming beyond the pre-industrial levels by as soon as 2035, not 2050, not 2100, by the year 2035, if emissions continue at their current pace. That would be the quickest warming in the contiguous United States and would occur as much as 2 decades before global average temperatures reach a similar point. The real-world effects of this warming trajectory are shocking. Sea levels in the Northeast could rise upwards of 11 feet by the end of the century. Almost 1/3 of the sandy shorelines along the Atlantic coast could erode inland at rates of at least 3.3 feet per year. We will feel the impact on our economy, which is so strongly tied to fishing, to our beaches and tourism, to our natural environmental resources. In 2012, a 2 centigrade water temperature increase boosted lobster landings to high summer levels a month earlier than usual. The result was an early supply glut and a collapse in prices to the lowest level in almost 2 decades. This type of negative impact on our fishing industries will become more commonplace as the climate continues to warm and our marine life is forced to move to new areas. Outdoor recreation in the Northeast, which will suffer the consequences of climate change, contributes nearly $150 billion in consumer spending and supports more than 1 million jobs across our region. Climate impacts like beach erosion are an imminent threat to this economic powerhouse. But perhaps most devastating will be the impacts on the public's health. According to the estimates, up to 10,000 people in Massachusetts could visit the emergency room annually due to the rising heat by the end of the century. Despite these generational warnings from both the United Nations and the scientists in our own country, President Trump has continued to dismiss the impending disaster from our dangerously warming planet. How did President Trump respond when asked about the conclusion that climate change could devastate the American economy? His answer? I don't believe it. Well, it doesn't matter if, Mr. President, you don't believe it, because the world's leading scientists have shown it to be true. And 70% of Americans believe it. They believe global warming is happening. President Trump may deny climate science, but there's no denying the consequences of climate change. But the Trump administration will not stop at climate denial. They have a much more insidious scheme to block action on climate, delay, deny, defund. The list of their climate sins is long, with each action more egregious than the last one. First came the appointment of the all-star big oil cabinet, Scott Pruitt at the EPA, former Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson at the State Department, former Texas Governor Rick Perry at the Department of Energy. Since Mr. Pruitt's ouster after numerous ethics violations, the Trump administration nominated King Coal's favored son, Andrew Wheeler, to head the EPA. Mr. Wheeler is a former coal industry lobbyist and has downplayed the recent science on the devastating impacts to come from climate change. After these reports came out, he said, quote, I have some questions about the assumptions. These are assumptions vetted by 300 leading scientists in the United States and across the planet. The only question, I believe, is why someone like Andrew Wheeler is put in charge at the EPA. A coal lobbyist is now the head of the EPA. EPA just turns into every polluter's ally. That's the net result of what Donald Trump has done at that agency. The Trump administration is also moving to freeze fuel economy standards rather than pushing for the historic and technically achievable goal of 54.5 miles per gallon by the year 2025. Now, I am the author of the 2007 law that required the first fuel economy increase in 32 years. And increasing our fuel economy standard to 54.5 miles per gallon is the single largest action that any nation has ever taken on climate, that one law. But the Trump administration is trying to make a U-turn on those standards, which are saving customers money at the pump and reducing the emissions we pump into the air. And the Trump administration is trying to repeal President Obama's Clean Power Plan. Turning our back on the roadmap for reducing pollution in the electricity sector will result in at least 12 times more carbon dioxide emissions over the next decade. And why is the Trump administration taking us backwards on climate in the face of these dire warnings? Just follow the money. Yesterday, during the weekly Senate Climate Change Task Force meeting, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cardin, and other colleagues and I heard about the complex funding behind the climate counter movement, which the fossil fuel industry has funded and used to mislead the American people and hold this administration hostage. The web of climate denial is nothing more than dirty energy corporations and their shady front groups spending over $250 million each year to deceive Americans about climate change. These corporations distort scientific consensus and turn it into an artificial political debate. They produce sham scientific documents like Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, a report published by the Heartland Institute and sent to over 300,000 science teachers across the country. Funding 300,000 documents to be sent to every science teacher in America over science which is patently untrue. That's how much money the fossil fuel industry has. That's how hard they try to send up a smoke screen around this issue, to terrify teachers that they might be getting in trouble if they actually teach accurate science rather than the bogus documents which are sent to them by the fossil fuel industry, by their handmaidens, the Heartland Institute. These fossil fuel phonies are on a mission to sow doubt, and their efforts seem to be bearing fruit in this administration. The web of denial messaging strategy is highly sophisticated, disciplined, and politically controlled. Conferences, advertisements, websites, talking heads, this fossil fuel-funded farce may be a well-oiled machine and well-funded, but they are wrong. What do we do in the face of this web of denial? We need to look at the dollars and cents of it. Not the big oil and king coal greenbacks, but the success of green energy. We are ushering our power sector into a clean energy future that is good for our environment and good for our economy. Coal cannot compete against wind, solar, and other renewables and natural gas in the free market. By the early 2020s, it could be cheaper to build new renewables from scratch than to continue operating old, dirty, coal-fired power plants. That's not a conspiracy. That's called competition. Adam Smith is smiling in his grave, watching this market force begin to take over. And that's why this renewable revolution has become unstoppable. It's because the cost of renewables is plummeting. The cost of solar has fallen 50 to 60% over the last 5 to 6 years. In fact, wind and solar are generally cheaper than coal and nuclear energy right now. Coal is losing the war against wind and solar in the free market. That's what we call it, the free market. The war on coal is a war that has been declared by the free market on coal. And it's lost that war. And it's not just happening here in the United States, it's happening all around the globe. Mexico has a power auction at the end of November of 2017 where the average price for solar was 1.9 cents per kilowatt hour. In 2017, solar in Saudi Arabia came in at 1.8 cents a kilowatt hour. In Dubai, it's 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour. Half of all electricity installed around the world last year was renewable. Let me say that. Half of all new electrical generation capacity in the world that was installed last year was renewables. So it's not just the United States. This is happening globally. The revolution is on. Renewable energy deployment around the world has increased by 8% a year for 7 years in a row. And globally, more than $330 billion was invested in clean energy last year. This is a global clean energy race. It is a global job creation race. It is a global clean energy investment race. We are going to save all of creation by engaging in massive job creation, as we have all of these people who are hired in order to install these new technologies. Right now, we have more than 50,000 megawatts of solar installed here in the United States. By 2020, we are projected to have more than 90,000 megawatts of solar. Solar is projected to add another 35,000 megawatts combined in 2021 and 2022, meaning that by the end of 2022, 4 years from now, we're going to have 250,000 megawatts of wind and solar in the United States. If you think of a nuclear power plant having 1,000 megawatts, the Seabrook nuclear power plant, the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, think of 250 solar and wind facilities that would be the equivalent of each one of those nuclear power plants. That's what we are talking about. And we have, by the year 2020, 500,000 people who will be employed in the wind and solar industry. Contrast that with the 50,000 people in the coal industry. 500,000 by 2020 in wind and solar. Who are they? They're roofers. They're electricians. They're engineers. They're people who are working with their hands to install all of this equipment. Now, the president doesn't seem to really care about those blue-collar workers, upwards of 500,000 by the year 2020. But they're working hard. They are working for good wages. And they're also not running the risk of inhaling dangerous air that can be dangerous to their health. So that's where we are. We have this incredible opportunity that is before us. It's already happening. The president is in denial. And the climate change fight is not just a question of job creation or economic imperative. It's about the moral imperative. We have to act. We know climate change will get worse. We know that lives will get lost. We cannot sit back and do nothing. In 2015, Pope Francis came to Capitol Hill, and he delivered his environmental Sermon on the Mount. He told us that mankind created this problem of climate change, and now mankind must fix it. With the world's poorest and most vulnerable suffering the worst consequences of climate change, extreme poverty, famine, disease, displacement, we have a moral obligation to act. I agree with Pope Francis that the United States and the Congress have an important role to play. We have a responsibility to help those less fortunate amongst us who will be harmed the most by rising seas, a warming planet, and more pollution spewing into our air and water. And that is why right now, in the next Congress, I am standing here with my colleagues in this fight to ensure that we take climate action for a price on carbon, for investment in clean energy, for resilient infrastructure, for 100% renewable energy in our country. If there is a tax extenders bill, we will be fighting for clean energy tax credits and for extenders to help reduce our carbon emissions, including for offshore wind, storage of electricity, for clean vehicles. We will be standing side by side in that fight in 2019 on the Senate floor so that we continue this revolution. If there is an infrastructure package, we will be fighting for aggressive renewable energy standards for utilities and the federal government and for coastal infrastructure needs. And as we work on appropriations, we will fight for more funding for energy efficiency and programs to protect the health of children and families from climate change. The climate challenges facing our nation and the entire world are indeed great. But the United States has the technological imperative to lead on solutions. We have the economic imperative to create opportunities for jobs for all people. And we have the moral imperative to protect our planet for future generations. The rest of the world will not listen to us and follow us if we do not, in fact, take these actions. You cannot preach temperance from a bar stool. You cannot ask other countries to act when we ourselves are walking away from that responsibility. That's the moment that we're in. And by January 1st of 2019, this battle is going to be on. We've been given the warning, and we're heeding it. And we're going to have mighty battles out here on the floor to make sure that future generations do not look back at us and wonder why we ignored all of those warnings that were given to us by the smartest scientists on the planet. Now, I would like to yield to my great colleague from the state of New Hampshire, a woman who has dedicated her career to the issues of clean energy up in her home state. I give you the great senator from New Hampshire, Jean Shaheen.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to my colleague, Senator Markey and Senator Whitehouse. I'm pleased to join both of you who have done such a tremendous job in leading on this issue of trying to get everyone to wake up to the challenges that we face from climate change and what that's going to mean, not just for us in New England, but for people across this country and across the globe. Last week, as you all have said, and maybe the reason we feel so passionate about this is because we see it. We see it happening already in New England, as my colleagues detailed so well. We're on the cutting edge of these changes, and you don't have to have lived in New Hampshire for very long to see what's happening as the result of climate change. Last week, the U.S. Global Change Research Program released its 4th National Climate Assessment, and that details the profound effect that climate change is having, and that it's going to continue to have on the environment, on the economy, and on our public health. And the report makes it abundantly clear that every American is affected by climate change, and that the threat it poses will get worse unless we take action. And as I said, people in my state of New Hampshire have no doubt about the reality of climate change because we've been seeing it for years now. We've been experiencing it. The steady increase in temperatures, the rise in annual precipitation, they're already affecting New Hampshire's tourism and outdoor recreation economy. Each year, hundreds of thousands of sportsmen and wildlife watchers come to New Hampshire to enjoy our mountains, our lakes, all of our beautiful natural resources. The outdoor economy, hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation contribute more than $4 billion to New Hampshire's economy each year. But this is threatened now because rising temperatures are shortening our fall foliage season. They're negatively affecting our snow and ice-related winter recreation activities. That includes skiing, snowboarding, and snowmobiling. The New Hampshire ski industry employs 17,000 Granite Staters, and the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services warns that these jobs are threatened by climate change. And New Hampshire's, in fact, all of New England's fall foliage is at risk. This is climate modeling by the Union of Concerned Scientists that shows that by the end of this century, New Hampshire summers will feel like present-day summers in North Carolina, 700 miles to our south, and while the presiding officer certainly understands that that works great for North Carolina, it changes dramatically what happens in New Hampshire. And what this shows is that this red color, which are the maple and beech and birch trees, the maple trees in particular, that produce our maple syrup, that make such a difference in our fall foliage, those are going to be gone by 2070, by the end of this century. All this red that we're seeing throughout, from Pennsylvania, New York, across northern New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine, that's all gone by the end of this century. So this underscores, again, that if we fail to act on climate change, we're going to see a steep loss of jobs and revenue that's going to affect our outdoor recreation industry. And it's going to affect our traditional maple syrup industry. New Hampshire produces more than 100,000 gallons of maple syrup annually. That makes it the 3rd largest maple syrup producer among the New England states. And maple syrup is entirely dependent on weather conditions. We're already seeing now the impact that these changes are having because as we get into the spring, the temperatures are not getting cold enough at night to make the sap run in the maple trees. And the days, we're not seeing the fluctuation in temperatures that allows maple syrup to be produced. The National Climate Assessment notes that the changing climate is putting more and more stress on sugar maples. And if we fail to act on climate change, this could destroy New Hampshire's multi-million-dollar maple syrup industry. Now, it's also affecting our wildlife. It's affecting their habitats. And probably one of the most iconic symbols of New Hampshire is our moose. And yet, they're being threatened. Because of milder winters due to climate change, ticks and other insects aren't dying off. That leads to infestation on our wildlife and our trees. And according to New Hampshire's Fish and Game Department, the estimated moose population in New Hampshire has decreased by more than 50% since the mid-1990s. That story's even worse for moose calves. A recent study by researchers at the University of New Hampshire found that winter ticks are the primary cause of an unprecedented 70% death rate of calves over a 3-year period. On average, and we can see this dramatically in these photos, 47,000 ticks were found on each calf that was monitored during this study. And to quote Dr. Peter Peekins, a professor at UNH, who is a lead author on the study, he says, the iconic moose is rapidly becoming the new poster child for climate change in parts of the Northeast. We are going to see moose totally disappearing from the Northeast, and in fact, all of the northern part of the United States, if we don't take action. And as my colleagues have said, global warming is also impacting our fishing industry. New Hampshire may have a small coast, 18 miles of coastline, but we have an important commercial fishing industry that contributes $106 million to the state and supports 5,000 jobs. Unfortunately, because of climate change, the average annual temperatures in the waters off of southern New England have increased by about 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1970s. And this change in temperature is driving some of New England's most iconic fisheries northward and further out to sea. Lobsters, for example, have migrated 40 miles northward to the Gulf of Maine in the last decade. And as we can see from this photo illustration, it shows the red areas where we used to have lobster until the 70s. They've totally disappeared, and those lobsters have moved north of Cape Cod, north, they're moving into northern Maine and up into Canada. They're totally gone from the New England Sound. That's devastating to southern New Hampshire fishing communities where lobster is their livelihood. And ironically, as I think Senator Markey said so well, the lobster migration has contributed to an overabundance in the Gulf of Maine, and that's caused price volatility in the lobster market. So we've seen dramatic fluctuations, which have also affected our fishermen. And of course, the impacts on human health have been dramatic because people are suffering from the impacts of climate change. Rising temperatures increase the number of air pollution action days. They increase pollen and mold. They increase allergies. And all of these things are dangerous to some of our most vulnerable populations, including children. In New Hampshire, we have one of the highest childhood asthma rates in the country because of air pollution that's been moving primarily from the Midwest, but now is being exacerbated by climate change. The elderly are affected, those with allergies, those with chronic respiratory conditions. And rising temperatures also facilitate the spread of insect-borne illnesses such as Lyme disease, which have been a huge factor for people in New Hampshire and across New England. Now, because New Hampshire and the northeastern states and New England have been experiencing major negative impacts from climate change, we've been working to reduce carbon emissions, to try and transition to a more energy efficient and clean energy economy. New Hampshire is one of 9 northeastern states that participates in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, since the program launched in 2009, and Massachusetts and Rhode Island are also participants. But carbon emissions in RGGI states have fallen by 51%. So in less than a decade, because of RGGI, we've seen a 51% reduction in carbon emissions. In addition, customers in RGGI states have saved an estimated $773 million on their energy bills, and billions more are expected. That's thanks not just to renewables, but to energy efficiency, and I'm a big believer that energy efficiency is also one of the most important ways we can reduce our carbon emissions. And also the wholesale price of energy has fallen. So we can see on average 6.4% and $773 million in energy savings. So climate change, as everyone who has spoken to this evening has pointed out, is probably the greatest environmental challenge the world has ever faced. But we can do something about it if we take action. Through smart energy policies, through thoughtful conservation measures, we can stop climate change from reaching dangerous, irreversible levels. But we have to act now. So I urge my colleagues, I urge this administration to recognize the economic and environmental imperative of addressing climate change before it's too late. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.